So, ladies and gentlemen, it is indeed a distinct honor and privilege for me to introduce our Crystal Eagle awardees this evening, John and Martha King. If you are a pilot, I think it's fairly safe to say you have heard of John and Martha King. Their faces are in more aviation catalogs than David and Clark headsets, and their videotapes and now online digital lessons have taught more people to fly than anybody else on Earth. Let that one sink in for just a second. Anybody else on Earth. I did a little research. There are about 600,000 licensed pilots in the United States. I did say a little bit of research. The Kings have sold, their website says, many millions of lessons. Millions of lessons, 600,000 pilots. You can do the math. That's a pretty big input in the people who are flying in our skies today. The Wright brothers may have given us a controlled, powered flight, but John and Martha King have given us the knowledge to safely follow in the Wright brothers' footsteps. The Kings have a passion for aviation, but far more importantly, they have figured out how to share that passion and spark the interest of flight in a generation of pilots. They have flown on, or should I say over, every continent in the world except Antarctica. They have flown just about every type of aircraft, and in fact are the only couple to ever obtain every category and class of FAA pilot and instructor certificate. And perhaps even more impressively is the fact that Martha is the only woman to have ever achieved this laudable goal. John and Martha live their passion. They own and regularly fly a Falcon 10 all over the country and are quoted in a recent AvBuyer article as stating that while the aircraft does not necessarily save them money over the airlines, it does allow them to meet with people in places that they might not otherwise. Their use of the Falcon 10 would be a perfect case study for the General Aviation Management course at San Jose State, as they go on to discuss how the use of the airplane allows them to depart San Diego in the morning, arrive at Cessna in Kansas in the afternoon, have a meeting in that day, take their 6 passengers back, and everybody's home with their family for dinner. Just try and do that with the airlines. In the more recent path, John and Martha have been working not just to train pilots to fly, but how to fly safer by improving our decision-making processes both in the air, but equally important on the ground prior to flight. While on their path to make us all better pilots, the King have received many honors and awards. Page 6 of your program is filled with them, but I want to point out a couple of my favorites. So in 1996, Professional Pilot magazine named them the Aviation Educators of the Year. And what I have here is no kidding. But 600,000 pilots, millions of lessons, Aviation Educators of the Year, obviously. In 2012, they were both inducted into the Living Legends of Aviation. Now, this is an honor reserved for a very small and exclusive group of pilots, and one I might point out is shared by 6 of our past Crystal Eagle awardees. And then one that I just think sounds cool. In 2014, the Honorable Company of Pilots awarded them the Sword of Honor. Now, I'd like to see that over my mantle. I think that'd be really cool. Well, despite how cool I think it sounds, it's not as cool, in my humble opinion, as the award we are going to present to them here tonight. In a slight break from the program and past tradition, this evening we are going to present the Crystal Eagle Award to the Kings prior to their presentation. However, before we do so, I would like to tell you a little bit about this very beautiful and unique award, and while I do that, I would ask John and Martha to join me on the stage. So as you saw in the program, the Kings have received numerous awards and honors, not surprising given their life's work. And while this is a very comprehensive list of honors, I get the privilege of adding what I think is the most unique award in aviation to their trophy case, the Aero Club of Northern California's Crystal Eagle. The Crystal Eagle is a beautiful piece of crystal artwork handcrafted in Italy. It is mounted on a redwood base sourced from our own Professor Tom Leonard's boyhood home in Northern California. Combined, the Crystal Eagle and redwood base represent the power, strength, and grace of the American eagle with the unusual durability and stability of the largest trees in the world. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me a great pleasure to award the 2017 Aero Club the Aero Club of Northern California Crystal Eagle Award to John and Martha King. This is the award.
Holy mackerel. That's gorgeous. I think it outweighs us.
I think so. You have to do it right down. All right.
Well, hello, folks. You know, one of the things we have to say is that what an enormous contribution you have made by your participation in the Aero Club of Northern California. One of the things that we have learned in our travels in aviation is where there is a sense of community, things go a lot better than when there is not a sense of community. They deal better with the government. If you're in a country that doesn't have a strong sense of community, their version of the FAA just goes and does whatever they want to do. Whereas if there's a community to deal with, the regulators deal with that community. So our future is brighter and better because you are participating in this sense of community. Also, the pilots behave better when there's a sense of community. We did a flying trip in China, and we were going to do an approach to Hainan Airport, and the pilot got down 5 miles from the airport at treetop level. We're just barely missing leaves, and we fly for 5 miles. He gets to the airport, he pulls the throttle, and the airplane slams down on the ground. And that's his idea of making a short field approach. The problem is, when there is not this sense of community, people tend to go feral. They just turn into almost wild animals doing it their way on their own. So Martha and I salute you for this participation that you're doing in the Aero Club of Northern California. Because of it, we have a safer and brighter future in aviation. Thank you for your participation.
And thank you very much for being here. You know, listening to Eric talk about the history of the Aero Club and Greg, National Aero Club, NAA, it's obvious how much passion you've got. And John and I, like you, have been passionate about flying all our lives and the people who do fly. And probably like many of you here, we've always owned and flown just a little bit more airplane than we could really afford to have. I hear some people acknowledging that, John, believing that. About us, if not about them. Yeah. When we were teaching live two-day ground schools, we were flying a Cessna 340 around the country, the pressurized Cessna Twin, which was a wonderful airplane for us. But after we went to video, I don't know, maybe money started burning a hole in our pocket, but we got this horrible sickness that we just had to take care of. And that sickness was, we had this terrible need to smell jet fuel. And that is a sickness, an expensive one. So we went out, we lost our heads, and we went out and we bought an old Cessna Citation 500. It was one of the very first business jets ever built. We loved it, but it was also one of the very slowest business jets ever built. And it got all kinds of horrible nicknames: a slowtation, a mutation, a crustation. The controllers called it a frustration. They had to keep moving us out of the way so that the real jets, the airliners, could pass us. You know, it had an unusual bird strike problem. You know what it was? Got run down from the rear. And Beechcraft used to have that ad for the King Air that said the King Air flies at near jet speeds. Our Citation 500 was the near jet they were talking about.
You know, it was before they called these Citations 1 or 2. It was a 500, so we used to call it a Citation 0. And so we had to put up with all these jets. We did jokes, I guess. We did it for about 10 years, and finally we got the hots for something faster. And we decided that we wanted to have this airplane we have now is an old Falcon 10. And that Falcon 10 is 150 knots faster than that Citation. Now you can imagine the insurance company had grave misgivings about this little mom and pop operation flying an airplane 150 knots faster. They said, look, John, Martha, we'll insure it, but we want to make sure that you go out and take the full course of simulator instruction in addition to getting type rated in the airplane. And we did that, and it was about 21 days, 3 weeks, and we sweated bullets. It's just about the hardest thing we have ever done as adults. But when we got done, we figured we must have done okay, because the instructor got us aside. He says, John, Martha, I've got wonderful news for you. And I said, well, that's fantastic. What's that? He says, well, you'll never have to worry about a mid-air collision in this airplane. And I said, that's wonderful. Why not? He says, you're so far behind this airplane, you won't even be involved. He says, you're going to come walking up to the crash site some 15 minutes later and go, what happened here? You know, Martha and I have been flying together for 10 years. Of these last 2 airplanes have required 2 pilots. And a lot of people look at me, they look at Martha, and they look at my personality, and they say, look, John, you're lucky Martha will fly with you. And I always say, lucky? What are you talking about lucky? She wants to fly half the time. It costs twice as much, and she's got an opinion about everything.
You know, John likes to think that our relationship exemplifies that old saying that behind every successful man stands a great woman.
Well, you've got that right, Martha. Thank you.
He doesn't realize that the real truth is, in front of every great woman stands some guy without a clue who's blocking her view.
I always lose these things. It happens every time. Well, we brought with us, in addition to some humor tonight, we brought with us some good news. Because things, are you pointing out something else to me?
No.
Why not? Okay. Things are getting better, and the reason I say that is the FAA has changed their outlook on how they want to deal with pilots, and I think we're all going to be better off because of it. First of all, the Flight Standards Division, these are the people who make the rules for how airplanes are flown, has come up with 4 core values. And the first one is they want a just culture. When a pilot is trying to get to, or an airplane operator trying to get to yes, they help you. Their idea is to get you over the hurdles, try and figure out how to get you to yes. They make risk-based decision-making. This is one of their core values. By that, we mean when they have to make a decision, they're going to say, what difference does it make in the outcome of a flight? Is there a risk that we're dealing with, or are we just making rules for the sake of making rules? And finally, they want to treat people as individuals. This person's in this situation, this person's in that situation. There are 2 different people in 2 different situations. Let's not try and make a rule for everybody and everything. So those are the 4 core values. And along with that, because of those core values, they've come up with what we call the compliance philosophy. And the compliance philosophy says that enforcement is only one way with dealing issues. Now remember, when Harrison Ford landed on a taxiway in Orange County Airport, a lot of people said Harrison Ford got off because he's famous. But he didn't get off because he's famous. He got off because of a new policy called the compliance philosophy that says enforcement is only one way to deal with it. We can have compliance actions, and we can focus on finding the most appropriate action when a deviation occurs. So they'll give training to someone. If the person didn't do it deliberately, and it's likely never to happen again. So let's not go out of our way to punish people. Let's just work with people, and that's what it's all about.
By the PR that Harrison got out of that, I'm pretty sure he won't do that one again.
I'm sure he's not going to do it again. And then finally, I think this is you, isn't it?
Well, it could be.
Okay.
The FAA is incorporating risk management much more deeply into everything that they do, and particularly into flight training. And that has resulted in the development of the Airman Certification Standards, which have been published for the private and the instrument, and I think the commercial was just recently published. And the rest of the ratings are coming. It just takes time to process it all. And the Airman Certification Standards, the ACS, has replaced the practical test standards. And what it is now is it's a single document that provides the guidance, the controlling guidance for, as the FAA puts it, everything a pilot is required to know or be able to do for a specific certificate or rating. And it's now the controlling guidance for the handbooks instead of the other way around. It used to be the handbooks controlled, and sometimes things got pretty haphazard and erratic because of different handbooks saying different things. Well, now the ACS is the controlling document that then feeds out to the handbooks. What the ACS does is provide for the first time standards for knowledge as well as for the skills that you demonstrate on the practical test. So applicants will have to be able to identify, assess, and mitigate risks for each task. Now, the way the FAA looks at that mitigate, they're not looking for a go, no-go kind of answer. They're looking for the ability of an applicant for a rating or certificate to analyze a situation and say things like, well, if I went earlier in the day, if I flew a different route, if I took maybe another pilot with me to help with the flight, maybe if I got some training before I went, whatever it takes in order to mitigate that situation. So what those, and they're trying to get people thinking about risk management from the very first lesson. And those standards for risk management that are in the ACS convert what were formerly subjective areas into objective ones. Any good designated pilot examiner has been testing applicants in their own way on risk management, but it's not really been formalized and standardized. And they want that risk management to be a habitual process, and the ACS standards are designed to provide guidance to instructors and evaluators, not just to students, to applicants. So the Airman Certification Standards require a new way of thinking about managing the risks of flight and a new vocabulary to express some unfamiliar concepts.
All right, now let's talk about why this is important. Now let me ask two questions. First of all, I'd like to question, how many people in here are pilots? If you're a pilot, put up your hand and hold it up. And I would say about 3/4 of us are pilots. And I can tell you one thing that tells me is that you're not normal. Because only 0.2% of the population of the United States is pilots. And the reason it's that small a percentage is it takes a lot of commitment and a lot of effort to be a pilot. So congratulations on that. We also know that you're an achiever because you became a pilot because you continued through all sorts of adversity and completed what you set out to do. So you're hardwired to get things done. Now, the second question I want to ask you about this, and this is why this whole new concept that the FAA is going on, the whole risk-based decision-making, the whole idea of having pilots identify risk, the reason this is important is this. How many people, and I'm going to ask you a question, by the way, and if the question is yes for you, I'd like for you to put your hand up, leave it up, and look around the room. Here is the question. How many people in here know someone personally who was killed in an aircraft accident? If the answer is yes for you, put your hand up, leave it up, and look around the room, and you can see that it's far better than 50%, or far worse than 50% of the people here in this room know someone personally who got killed in an aircraft accident. Folks, the FAA is working on this. You can put your hand down now. Thank you very much, but we've got to do better than this. And we are going to do better than that. And all of these changes, believe it or not, the compliance philosophy is going to be a great tool to fix that problem. So I am very hopeful about the FAA's efforts on this. I'm also hopeful about a sense of community making a difference. And I think we can improve the general aviation accident rate, the general aviation fatality rate, which has been historically just terrible, just absolutely terrible. So we can do better than that, we will, and we're on our way. So that's what we're talking about here today, and that's why it's important.
What's happening is that historically, the way pilots have learned risk management is by exposing themselves to risk. And then they evaluate the result. What happened? If it's not too scary, they'll then call it acceptable. They go out and try something, and if they don't scare the daylights out of themselves, they'll say, okay, that's acceptable. But in reality, they may have just been lucky. And the more times that they get away with doing something, the more acceptable it is, the more normal it becomes for them. On the other hand, if they scare the daylights out of themselves, what they'll do is add it to a long list of, I'm not going to do that again. And if they don't run out of luck, they become what we call experienced pilots. But the problem is, experience is a hard teacher. She's a hard teacher because she gives the test first and the lesson comes afterwards. And the problem is, a lot of times pilots and their passengers don't live to get the lesson. Experience is great, but it doesn't prepare people for unanticipated risks. And to manage risk, we as pilots have to be proactive, not reactive. And as a community, historically, we've had no real experience at providing guidance to instructors and applicants about risk management, how to identify risk, how to analyze risk, evaluate it, and then how to mitigate it without putting it in a black and white, go, no-go kind of a situation. So among the things we need to do as a community is to rethink our vocabulary about risk management. We need to develop more helpful, more insightful vocabulary and rethink some of the terms that we've been using for years that don't help learning pilots as much as we could as instructors and as peers, pilot peers of theirs could.
So I'm going to say something counterintuitive. When we talk about changing our vocabulary, here's the first step. Let's quit talking about safety. And the reason why I say we should quit talking about safety is very often when we say words, sentences containing safety, we don't really mean what we say. We're lying to ourselves. For instance, very often an official will stand out at a crash scene and say, safety is our #1 priority. Well, if safety were your #1 priority, you wouldn't start an engine, because starting an engine isn't safe. You wouldn't ever move an airplane. We're lying to ourselves. It's not true. We don't really mean it. The other thing we will say is there can be no compromise with safety. Well, yes, there's a compromise with safety. You move the airplane. It'd be much safer just leave it where it is. So the point is, when we say these things, we don't really mean them. And so we're lying to ourselves, and we're talking about an intellectually dishonest vocabulary that we've been using, and it hasn't served us well. The second thing I say about why we shouldn't talk about safety is it doesn't give you any guidance. When someone says, have a safe trip, how do I do that? Don't go? And we'll say there can only be one standard of safety. No, you got to have different standards of safety for different aircraft, because you can't afford the same level of safety in a general aviation airplane that you can in a 747. You can't carry the weight of the safety equipment. You can't afford the cost of all the safety equipment. We've got to start talking honestly with ourselves, and to do that, we need to get off the vocabulary of safety and get on the vocabulary of risk management. So when we start talking about risk management, we're then talking about how we're going to get a safer result. We also should quit using insulting terms. We tell people they're no good at aeronautical decision making, or no good at judgment. Or we talk about the 5 hazardous attitudes. We're proposing that an 18-year-old flight instructor talk to their 40-year-old learning pilot and say, today I'm going to teach you about judgment. And the 40-year-old's likely to say, I don't think so, kid. These are terms that don't serve us well, so we need to change our vocabulary. And so a lot of people confuse risk management with judgment and attitude, but it's not. Risk management is a habitual procedure that you use to get the results you want. So we'll talk about risk management.
Risk management basically has two main components. The first is a habit of maintaining situational awareness. Notice I said habit, not judgment, not decision-making. A habit of maintaining situational awareness by systematically thinking about risks, thinking about them from the first flight lesson all the way through our flying careers. And the second is mitigation strategies for the risks that you have thought of. A lot of flight instruction is all about developing habits. We go out for a pre-flight and we meticulously inspect our aircraft before we take it in the air. When we are getting ready to go in the air, and we are in the air, we're using checklists all the time. So we fasten seatbelts. We have lots of other habits. And that's what we're talking about as far as risk management is concerned. Risk management is just another one of those habits. And once we learn it, once we teach it to our learning pilots, it will serve us and them well for the rest of their flying careers. Now, there are different kinds of pilots that get into trouble with risk management. One of them is the fat, dumb, and happy pilot. The cure for being fat, dumb, and happy is relatively simple. We help pilots, we help our peers, we help our students learn to use habit patterns and tools. Get in the habit of maintaining situational awareness, get in the habit of identifying risks. That tends to cure the fat, dumb, and happy. The other kind of pilot for which risk is a real issue is more complicated. That's the pilot who doesn't want to mitigate the risk.
The reason they don't want to mitigate the risk is they fall into two main groups. The first group is there are a few big shot show-off thrill seekers out there that they think that stepping into risk makes them look like a better pilot. They're a he-man because they can take risks. They think it makes them look really smart. So there's a tendency for these pilots, the show-off pilots, to keep on taking risks until they and their passengers pay the ultimate price. And that's a hard group to deal with. We've had a lot of them. We had a guy who just recently got killed by running his tires on the water, and there's been a whole bunch of those guys around. So how we deal with them as a community, I don't know. That's going to be our hardest one. The other guy is the guy that is an achiever. This room full of people we just talked about, that you're a room full of achievers, because we know you're hardwired to become an achiever, be an achiever, because that's how you became a pilot, because you're hardwired to complete what you set out to do. That group is a little easier to deal with, and that's who most of us are in general aviation. And so what we need to do is take these rooms full of achievers and tell them being an achiever is another risk factor. That is a risk factor for you. And it's a wonderful characteristic in almost all of life, but we need to recognize that the fact that we are hardwired risk achievers makes us risky, and we can deal with that. So what we encourage you to do
is to exercise leadership. Use the power of the community that you have, the power of your association with your fellow pilots, the power of your ability to mentor them and to provide guidance, to exercise leadership. Help pilots learn how to develop the habit of identifying the risks of flight, and help them develop procedures to be introspective of, be aware of and introspective about why they might be resistant to mitigating risks. Because a lot of us are. John and I know that for a fact in our own experience. It is not easy to overcome, but the biggest way to help pilots overcome it is to help make them aware that their goal orientation is probably the biggest risk factor in any of their flying.
So we encourage you as leaders to help people understand that this idea that they want to complete what they set out to do is a risk factor, and follow through on that, because the future of our aviation community depends on it. Thank you very much, folks.
Thank you.
Well, Captain, shall we go sit down?
Aren't you going to ask if anyone wants to argue with what I said?
Does anyone have any questions or want to argue with something Martha might have said? All right.
Thank you.
So, hold on just a second.
All right.
There is one other thing I neglected to do. Would you go back to the slide that shows the, if you guys would pick this up for just a moment. I want you to stand there and look adoringly at it.
All right.
As I read what
At
it
each
says,
other or at it?
Whatever works for you. So we have a nice little plaque on the front of that, and I thought that I would share what it says with all of you. The Aero Club of Northern California Crystal Eagle Award to John and Martha King. Oh, you moved it on me too fast. In recognition of their lifelong contributions to aviation as educators who are advancing our industry and saving countless lives by teaching pilots with innovative multimedia and championing improvements to FAA test standards and risk management practices. November 18th, 2017. And I think given the presentation they just gave, it's a perfect description of the award. Congratulations once again. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You want to take it back?
No, we'll take it back.